Hey everybody, this is Charles of Side by Side Garage. This is part 3 of the RZR transmission series. I will be installing a set of Optimum Off-Road 19% reduction stage 3 gears and a Rock Ready UTV heavy duty bearing retainer plate. I will also cover how to properly adjust the pinion gear backlash. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Okay, in the last episode, part 2, I explained what a gear reduction was, and then I went over the ACE 325 gear reduction, which is right here with your reverse shaft and your stage 2, as well as the Ranger low. Now, for the sake of the video, to show you how to do an ACE 325 gear install, I went ahead and put the shaft back together, so this is still the stock shaft right here. A stage 3 reduction, which we're going to install from Optimum Off-Road, is going to be a 19%. We're going to replace that factory shaft right there, and then we're going to replace this gear that it mates to. So whenever you buy the gears, you get the shaft right there, and then you get that other gear that it mates to. They also give you some instructions as well as a couple new snap rings. Something I instantly noticed about these gears is that these are actually a straight cut gear instead of an angled cut like the factory. So these are going to be a little bit louder, but a buddy has these in his transmission, and even though they were loud at first, that noise quieted it down some as the gears got a little bit of mileage on them. So keep that in mind whenever you do these reductions. These have a coating on them, and you're going to need to make sure and clean that coating off of there really well before you do this install. All right, whenever I pull out this pinion shaft right here to do the stage 3 reduction, I'm also going to be changing out my bearing retainer plate. The stock bearing retainer plates are pretty thin. They're just a little bit less than 3/16 of an inch, and they're known to warp. Now, the turbo transmissions, as you can see right here, they have a 6-bolt plate in them, whereas your non-turbos, except for the RS1, your non-turbos have a 4-bolt plate. And these 4-bolt plates are really prone to bending. Whenever this bearing retainer plate's allowed to deform or bend, the gears down inside there can actually come apart from each other a little bit. And whenever they're out closer to the edges, you're more likely to break a tooth off. And if you break a tooth off down in there, it can get caught between the gears, and that's whenever you see these guys blowing out the part of the transmission down here. So these Rock Ready UTV bearing retainer plates are a great upgrade. You can see that they're more than twice as thick. There's material added on the inside. And on the 4 bolts, it's the same on the outside. On these turbo transmissions, you're able to add material on both the inside and the outside. So these are quite a bit stronger than a factory plate is. And this is a really high strength steel right here. While we have this bearing retainer plate out, and we're doing all these modifications, I'm also going to show you how to set the backlash. Now, on a turbo transmission, you can set the backlash simply by putting a tool in here and turning it whenever you have the bearing retainer plate bolts out of there. But on a non-turbo transmission, this seal is actually larger and comes all the way out to the edge of the case. So on those non-turbo transmissions, you're actually going to have to pull the seal out in order to set the backlash on it. And there's a special tool for it, and I'll show you that here in just a second. On the turbo transmission, you don't have to pull that seal out unless you're going to be replacing bearings, which I am going to be replacing these bearings inside there. So I'm going to go ahead and pull it out of there. When you pull the seals out, they get destroyed. So you got to make sure that you have an extra one on hand to put back in there. Okay, so real fast, we're going to go over the tools required to do the work. If you're just going to do a bearing retainer plate, then you just need your 10 and 12 millimeter sockets to get your case open. You need a 5 millimeter Allen so that you can unbolt the bearing retainer plate. You need the snap ring pliers and a puller so that you can remove the bearings and the gears. And then you also need the press so that you can put it back together. If you're going to be setting the backlash, then you also need the tool so that you can actually change the backlash right here. Now this right here is the actual Polaris part. See the part number there? This one is a homemade one. It works, it just doesn't work as well. So I'm going to use the Polaris one. Then on these turbo transmissions, you got to be able to take this nut off there. So I've got the 30 mil socket for that. Anytime you take these bolts out, you need to make sure that you Loctite them. So I've got some red Loctite for that. If you're going to be doing the stage 3 reduction 19% like I am, then you also need a tool so that you can clearance the transmission case just a little bit. So I'm going to use this air die grinder with a carbide bit. All right, we're going to start back off on the transmission here so that we can remove everything out and then start doing the stage 3 19% reduction right here. So you can remove your reverse idler. Get your shift drum out. Get your shift forks out. Pull out the input shaft. Remember, on those chain transmissions, you have to pull all 3 of these out together. On a turbo transmission, you can pull the input out by itself. Okay. All right, the next thing we're going to do is actually pull out our stage 2 right here, and we're going to transfer it over onto the new shaft from Optimum Off-Road. Normally, you would just transfer this bearing over onto the shaft. Since I'm putting brand new bearings in, I don't need to. I can just store this one. Got the new bearing on there. Flip it back over, take this bearing off. Take your snap ring pliers. Now I'm going to use the press this ace gear back off of there, and then I'll transfer it over onto the new Optimum Off-Road Stage 3. Press it off of there. Got to put it onto the new one. Remember, splines and then that machine surface right there, so the gear goes on this way. We got the gear pressed on. Throw your washer back on. Your snap ring. All right, what you saw right there was the snap ring. It didn't quite want to seat down in there, and I had went back to the press again and pushed the gear on there, and I mean, it's seated all the way on there, so maybe it's just the tolerances within this Optimum Off-Road gear set. Maybe that groove right there for the snap ring's a little bit tight. So, but she's on there now. She's not going anywhere, so I'm going to get this bearing pressed onto this end. All right, so I got this shaft and the gears and everything transferred over right there. And this normally sits right down there. So I've got to swap that gear over to the Optimum Off-Road gear. And then at the same time, I'm going to change out the bearing retainer plate. And I'm also going to set the backlash. At this point, you might as well pull out your sub-assembly output. It just lifts up. Be gentle when you're doing it because you don't want to tear up your axle seals. I'm going to go ahead and get these bearings off here, swapped over to my new ones. All right, before I actually pull this out, I'm going to go ahead and get this bearing pulled off there just to make it a little easier because this is actually holding it up. The bearing out of the way, I can go ahead and use the snap ring pliers. Get this snap ring off. Washer. Now I'll actually go use the press to press this off. In order to get this out though, you've got to take these out. You won't be able to get your bearing retainer plate off until you actually pull this gear off. So let's say you were only doing a bearing retainer plate, you would still have to be able to pull this bearing off, pull this gear off, so you could swap the bearing retainer plate. Now, just because you change the bearing retainer plate, you take this out, does not necessarily mean that you have to change or set your backlash. Your backlash can't really change unless you turn this right here. So once you get those bolts out, you can take the pinion out. All right, now that this is out, I'll be able to go over to the press this gear off, swap this plate with my Rock Ready ETV heavy duty one that's thicker, and then I'll be able to put this gear on in place of this one, and then put my washer, snap ring, and bearing on here. All right, as you can see, I went ahead and got it all torn down. I took off the old bearings, put the new bearings on there, and then put the heavy duty bearing retainer plate. I pressed on the Optimum Off-Road gear, and then put the new bearing up on this end. Now that we have this back together, I'm going to put this in the other case half. That way we can mark off where it is we're going to have to clearance. All right, so I set up a makeshift workbench here, and then what I did was put the pinion shaft down inside the transmission case half where it sits, and something pretty interesting is happening, and that is that right now my gear is clearing the case. Now I've done a few of these reductions, the stage 3 Optimum Off-Road reductions, and the 19% would hit the case right there, and you would have to take off, I mean, maybe it's not a lot, it's like maybe a 1/16 of an inch at most of material to clear, but mine is clearing. All right, so what I did on the previous transmissions when I've done these installs, I actually stuck it in there and I would spin it, and the gear would end up marring up the transmission just a little bit. Like you couldn't get it pushed all the way inside. The bearing would only start, and then you would have to take a Sharpie and just kind of mark off a rectangle like this, and then you'd use like your die grinder or whatever, take the material out, and then just keep doing a test fit. You know, you want to take just the smallest amount of material as possible until the bearing would actually slide all the way in and seat, and your gear would still clear. Like I said, it's not very much material that you would normally take out, but for some reason, this case clears. So I guess I got lucky. Normally I would set the backlash right now, but what I need to do is actually pull this shaft all the way out, because I have to be able to replace both the bearings that are in there. If you're just setting your backlash or you were just doing the bearing retainer plate, you don't have to do this part right here. All right, to get this out, it doesn't just slide out. The case is actually threaded. All right, now before I get this thing all the way out, what I'm going to do is use a self-tapping screw and actually drill into the seal and then pull it out with a set of vice grips. I wish I had the camera rolling because it popped out pretty easy, but what I did was just use a screw in there, and then I stuck this little pry bar through, and I just did a quick pry like that, and the seal just popped right out. So, all right, so we're going to continue with the snorkel tool and get that the rest of the way out of there. All right, there she goes. Ooh, tilt that up, making a mess. All right, so now you can see bearing with a snap ring in there. And you've got all these little teeth or whatever right here. And this is how you set the backlash, because, grab it here, that long bolt, the one long bolt went down through the bearing retainer plate, goes down through the aluminum, and then it goes into, like, right in between those teeth like that. And that's what, like, after you set your backlash, that's what keeps your backlash in the same spot. It can't loosen up on you or anything like that because of this bolt being in there. Now that I got that out, I'm gonna replace these two bearings real quick, and then I'll slam it in there and show you how to set the backlash. All right, now that I got the snorkel back together, we can put it back inside of the transmission housing. Now remember, the only reason I did this was because of the bearings. If you were just setting backlash, you wouldn't have had to do that part right here. There she goes. I'm using my other hand just to help kind of line up that inside bearing until it gets started in there. Like that right there. Now I can use our snorkel tool again. All right, the next step after you get the snorkel back in there, or if you never took it out, is to take your pinion and set it back down inside there. There she goes. All right, see, we got it in there. All you do is spin the bearing retainer plate and line it back up with the bolt holes. Now, whenever you buy a Rock Ready UTV bearing retainer plate, it comes with longer bolts. So make sure if you're using one of them, use the longer bolts. The reason why is because the steel's thicker. So if you were to put this short bolt through that thicker piece of steel, you wouldn't have nearly as much thread engagement. So it'd be pretty weak. So make sure you use the longer bolts. You need to make sure and use some red Loctite on these. I always start them by hand. And you're going to put in just the short bolts. Don't put in that long one yet. Now you're going to tighten the bearing retainer plate screws to 10 foot-pounds. Remember, we don't have the last one in there yet. So if you were doing a 1K or a general, you would only be tightening 3 screws right now. I like to do a star pattern whenever I do it, and I'll usually torque them to about halfway first, so about 5 or so foot-pounds. And then I'll go up to 10 foot-pounds. Now that we've got those, we actually have to set the backlash. In order to set it, what you're going to need to do, here I'll let slop, is actually back this back out. Now whenever you're backing this out counterclockwise, remember, you're going to pull that bearing and that gear this way so it'll mesh into that other gear tighter. And we're going to go to 0 backlash. Now 0 backlash in the manual, it says it's going to be tight. There should be like some tight spots in it, and there's no way to check it with a feeler gauge. It's simply to back it out of there until you have those real tight spots in it whenever you try to spin it. All right, that right there is going to be 0 backlash. It doesn't really want to turn no more. And whenever I spin it, it's kind of loose. And then I feel hard spots right there. So that's 0. Once you get it to 0 backlash, you need something similar to this. All it has to be is just a long tool that is not very big around. It needs to be smaller than the diameter of your bolt. The reason why is because you're going to stick it down into this hole where that bolt goes, and you're just going to use it to feel like this. Because it should drop down into one of the notches. While that's down in there, you can take your snorkel tool and just slowly go clockwise, because right now you just want to find that first point, that first notch. It feels like I'm up against it right there, up against this, which means that it's down in the notch. So I'm going to pull it up slightly, this right here. And I'm slowly going to turn the snorkel clockwise. Yep. So right there's the top. I'm no longer down in the notch. Now, according to the manual, you're supposed to go to the 3rd notch. So turn it here. There's 1, because it'll go down in now. Turn it some more. Now, notice I constantly keep pushing down until I find the next notch. There's 2. Going across the top of the ridge again. And there's the 3rd notch right there. Now, once you get to the 3rd notch, you're supposed to feel the snorkel and see if there's any tight spots on it. If there's any sort of tight spots or anything like that, then you need to back it off to the 4th notch down inside there. We can go ahead and take the last bolt, put some red Loctite on it, and put it down in there. What I'm noticing now that I tighten down that bolt right there is that there's just ever so slightly a spot in there. So I may need to back this out to the 4th notch like the manual says. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this bolt back out. Take my tool again so I can feel down in there. I'm going to go over 1 more notch now so that I'm on the 4th one. And I'm just going to put the bolt back in there and feel it and see which one I like better. There's just that small little click you can hear in there, but that feels better. I don't feel those tight spots anymore. So I think I'm going to leave it like that. And I mean, the other one, it wasn't real tight before, but it was enough that I think that there was just a little more pressure than I would like on there. And that's how you set the backlash. At this point, what I'm going to do is go ahead and get this edge of the transmission case cleaned up, because I'm done doing all the modifications on the inside of here. So I've got to clean this up. That way it'll be ready for gasket. Once I get it cleaned up, everything wiped down, I can get all the gears and everything back inside of it, and then we'll seal it up, and I can show you how to do all that. All right, so what I use to clean up all the old gasket residue, I usually use a combination of a razor blade to kind of scrape at it. I'll just use the towel or rag and rub on it to get it off there. And sometimes if it's really being a pain in the butt and doesn't want to come off, I'll use a wire brush. This is a stainless steel wire brush. If you're going to use this, don't be too aggressive with it, and definitely don't use an electric one or pneumatic one, because you don't want to damage the aluminum. You want to have this surface the way it is right now. Okay, so at this point I've cleaned the mating surface on both halves of the transmission, so I can go ahead and put everything back inside of it so that we can get it sealed up. So I can take my sub output, Now we can grab our stage 2 and our reverse gear. Remember, low gear goes up top. You got to mate these two together before you put them in there. And on your non-turbos, you have to do these two and the input shaft all at the same time. On turbos, you just do these two. All right, those are in there. There we go. Just had to slide it over the edge of the table a little bit so that this would clear. Drop the input shaft down through. Don't force anything. Slide that in there. Take your reverse gear, that's in there. Your shift forks, remember they go this way. All right, I flipped around to the other side just so you can see the shift forks mating up with the shift dogs. Now you can grab your shift drum. Now remember, you got to make sure that all three of these line up with the channels on the shift drum. Now at this point, I like to do a quick bench test. Now if you remember from my first video, I said that it's the easiest to put the transmission back together whenever it's in high. So right now would be a good time, if you did your bench test, to leave it in high gear. If you don't leave it in high gear, it's not the end of the world. And I'll show you that here in just a minute. Do one last wipe down, since you probably touched the surfaces. All right, this right here is what I like to use to seal the transmission back up. I've used this on every single transmission I've done, and I've never had a transmission leak. So this is what I suggest. Whenever you seal this up, you need to make sure that you leave the transmission sitting for at least a minimum of 24 hours before you actually put fluid in it. Now you don't need to go crazy putting this on there, but it's one of those times that it's better to have it on there and wipe off the extra afterwards than not put enough. Because if you don't put enough, it's going to leak, and then you got to do a lot of work taking the transmission back out just so you can clean it up and seal it back up. Do a quick check around the case to make sure didn't miss any spots. Now we got the ultra gray on there. We can go ahead and put the case half back on there. Now that you have the case halves back together, you can take all your bolts, put them down in there. And I always like to start them by hand. At that point, switch over to your torque wrench, and you're going to go to 20 foot-pounds. Once you get all the bolts torqued down to the 20 foot-pounds, I would suggest using some napkins, paper towels, or whatever, and go ahead and get that extra gasket material off there. After you get that all wiped down, jump up here to the gear selector cover and just go ahead and get this mating surface all cleaned up and ready. All right, next you gather up all the components for your gear selector, and we'll put all these in there. Start off with this. Now, the splines on here have a master spline, so this will only go on one way, and it doesn't matter if you flip it over, it'll still work either direction. Next, you grab this. Put it in like that. Now you can see the one mark is in between the two. This transmission's in high right now. Take this. Again, there's a master spline on there, so it'll only go one way. Slide it over like that. Take this. It goes, this flanged side is going to go down, and it's got the master splines. Drop it on like that. Your little roller will come over. And then you take your spring and put it in there. Now, real fast, what I'm going to end up doing is taking it out of high to show you that you can still put this all together even though it's not in high. All right, I used my set of pliers and I turned the shift drum right here. I'm not even sure what it's in right now, but it's not in high. See, the mark is way over on this side now. If you're going to take this, you would have to put it down in here and actually start counting your gears to make sure that whenever this rotates, this one mark would end up in between those two. That's why it makes it way easier if you're in high gear. You got to clean off your gear selector cover. All right, so at this point, either right before or right after you put this cover back on, I like to do one last bench test. I like to go through all the gears to make sure that everything's still good. All right, so now we know that the transmission was put back together. This is all cleaned up, so you can take your gasket maker. Same thing, just like whenever you put the two case halves together. It's better to have a little extra than not enough. The little gasket, once it dries, if any of it's on the inside, it's not going to hurt nothing. That seal around the little shaft there is still new, so it's kind of tight. Yep. She was just hung up right there. Push it down on there. Grab your gear selector cover screws. Always start them by hand. That way, make sure that you're not stripping anything out. Switch over to your torque wrench. You're going to tighten these to 12 foot-pounds. Okay. Grab a napkin, paper towel, clean off your extra. Now that we got the cover back on and those are all torqued down, take your gear selector sensor, push it down on there. You got a flat washer, then you've got a spring washer, and then you've got this little clip. All right, now that that's done, I still need to put my new seal back on my snorkel there, and then put this flange on, the two washers, and torque the nut down. All right, just real quick, I had to get the new seal in there, Now I'm able to get my coupler back on there. Put the two washers. These are a locking washer. And you put the jam nut. Now you got to torque this jam nut to 140 foot-pounds, and I can't do that on the bench. Transmission is just going to go everywhere. So I'm not going to actually torque this nut down until the transmission is back in the RZR. All right, so at that point the transmission is done. This is just a reminder, after you seal up a transmission, you need to make sure and let this thing sit for 24 hours at a minimum. That way the seal doesn't leak on you. If you guys actually learned something from this video, then make sure you give us a like, share it with your buddies, give us a follow on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, and we'll catch you guys next time.